1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 31. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 10. The Cataract and the Desert, Part 1. At Aswan, one bids goodbye to Egypt and enters Nubia through the gates of the cataract, which is in truth no cataract, but a succession of rapids extending over 2/3 of the distance between Elephantine and Philae. The Nile, diverted from its original course by some unrecorded catastrophe, the nature of which has given rise to much scientific conjecture, here spreads itself over a rocky basin bounded by sand slopes on the one side and by granite cliffs on the other. Studded with numberless islets, divided into numberless channels, foaming over sunken rocks, eddying among water-worn boulders, now shallow, now deep, now loitering, now hurrying, here sloping in the ribbed hollow of a tiny sand-drift, there circling above the vortex of a hidden whirlpool, the river, whether looked upon from the deck of the dahabeah or the heights along shore, is seen everywhere to be fighting its way through a labyrinth, the paths of which have never been mapped or sounded. These paths are everywhere difficult and everywhere dangerous, and to that labyrinth the Shelidi, or cataract Arab, alone possesses the key. At the time of the inundation, when all but the highest rocks are under water, and navigation is as easy here as elsewhere, the Shelidi's occupation is gone. But as the floods subside and travellers begin to reappear, his work commences. To haul dahabeahs up those treacherous rapids by sheer stress of rope and muscle, to steer skilfully down again through channels bristling with rocks and boiling with foam, becomes now, for some 5 months of the year, his principal industry. It is hard work, but he gets well paid for it, and his profits are always on the increase. From 40 to 50 dahabeahs are annually taken up between November and March, and every year brings a greater influx of travellers. Meanwhile, accidents rarely happen, prices tend continually upwards, and the cataract Arabs make a little fortune by their singular monopoly. The scenery of the first cataract is like nothing else in the world except the scenery of the second. It is altogether new and strange and beautiful. It is incomprehensible that travellers should have written of it in general with so little admiration. They seem to have been impressed by the wildness of the waters, by the quaint forms of the rocks, by the desolation and grandeur of the landscape as a whole, but scarcely at all by its beauty, which is paramount. The Nile here widens to a lake. Of the islands, which it would be hardly an exaggeration to describe as some hundreds in number, no two are alike. Some are piled up like the rocks at the Land's End in Cornwall, block upon block, column upon column, tower upon tower, as if reared by the hand of man. Some are green with grass, some golden with slopes of drifted sand, some planted with rows of blossoming lupins, purple and white. Others again are mere cairns of loose blocks, with here and there a perilously balanced top boulder. On one, a singular, upright monolith, like a menhir, stands conspicuous, as if placed there to commemorate a date or to point the way to Philae. Another mass rises out of the water squared and buttressed, in the likeness of a fort. A third, humped and shining like the wet body of some amphibious beast, lifts what seems to be a horned head above the surface of the rapids. All these blocks and boulders and fantastic rocks are granite, some red, some purple, some black. Their forms are rounded by the friction of ages. Those nearest the brink reflect the sky like mirrors of burnished steel. Royal ovals and hieroglyphed inscriptions, fresh as of yesterday's cutting, start out here and there from those glittering surfaces with startling distinctness. A few of the larger islands are crowned with clumps of palms, and one, the loveliest of any, is completely embowered in gum trees and acacias, dome and date palms, and feathery tamarisks, all festooned together under a hanging canopy of yellow-blossomed creepers. On a brilliant Sunday morning, with a favourable wind, we entered on this fairy archipelago. Sailing steadily against the current, we glided away from Aswan, left Elephantine behind, and found ourselves at once in the midst of the islands. From this moment every turn of the tiller disclosed a fresh point of view, and we sat on deck, spectators of a moving panorama. The diversity of subjects was endless. The combinations of foam and colour, of light and shadow, of foreground and distance, were continually changing. A boat or a few figures alone were wanting to complete the picturesqueness of the scene, but in all those channels and among all those islands we saw no sign of any living creature. Meanwhile the sheik of the cataract, a flat-faced, fishy-eyed old Nubian, with his head tied up in a dingy yellow silk handkerchief, sat apart in solitary grandeur at the stern, smoking a long chibouque. Behind him squatted some 5 or 6 dusky strangers, and a new steersman, black as a negro, had charge of the helm. This new steersman was our pilot for Nubia. From Assuan to Wady Halfa, and back again to Assuan, he alone was now held responsible for the safety of the dahabeah and all on board. At length a general stir among the crew warned us of the near neighbourhood of the first rapid. Straight ahead, as if ranged along the dyke of a weir, a chain of small islets barred the way, while the current, divided into 3 or 4 headlong torrents, came rushing down the slope and reunited at the bottom in one tumultuous race. That we should ever get the Philae up that hill of moving water seemed at first sight impossible. Still our steersman held on his course, making for the widest channel. Still the sheik smoked imperturbably. Presently, without removing the pipe from his mouth, he delivered the one word, "Row!" forward. Instantly, evoked by his nod, the rocks swarmed with natives. Hidden till now in all sorts of unseen corners, they sprang out shouting, gesticulating, laden with coils of rope, leaping into the thick of the rapids, splashing like water dogs, bobbing like corks, and making as much show of energy as if they were going to haul us up Niagara. The thing was evidently a coup de théâtre, like the apparition of Clan Alpine's warriors in the Donna del Lago, with baksheesh in the background. The scene that followed was curious enough. 2 ropes were carried from the dahabeah to the nearest island, and there made fast to the rocks. 2 ropes from the island were also brought on board the dahabeah. A double file of men on deck, and another double file on shore, then ranged themselves along the ropes. The sheik gave the signal, and, to a wild chanting accompaniment and a movement like a barbaric Sir Roger de Coverley dance, a system of double hauling began, by means of which the huge boat slowly and steadily ascended. We may have been a quarter of an hour going up the incline, though it seemed much longer. Meanwhile, as they warmed to their work, the men chanted louder and pulled harder, till the boat went in at last with a rush and swung over into a pool of comparatively smooth water. Having moored here for an hour's rest, we next repeated the performance against a still stronger current a little higher up. This time, however, a rope broke. Down went the haulers like a row of cards suddenly tipped over. Round swung the Philae, receiving the whole rush of the current on her beam. Luckily for us, the other rope held fast against the strain. Had it also broken, we must have been wrecked then and there ignominiously. End of section 31. Miles up the Nile, section 32. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 10, The Cataract and the Desert, Part 2. Our Nubian auxiliaries struck work after this. Fate, they said, was adverse, so they went home, leaving us moored for the night in the pool at the top of the first rapid. The sheik promised, however, that his people should begin work next morning at dawn, and get us through before sunset. Next morning came, however, and not a man appeared upon the scene. At about midday they began dropping in, a few at a time, hung about in a languid, lazy way for a couple of hours or so, moved us into a better position for attacking the next rapid, and then melted away mysteriously by 2s and 3s among the rocks, and were no more seen. We now felt that our time and money were being recklessly squandered, and we resolved to bear it no longer. Our painter therefore undertook to remonstrate with the sheik, and to convince him of the error of his ways. The sheik listened, smoked, shook his head, replied that in the cataract, as elsewhere, there were lucky and unlucky days, days when men felt inclined to work, and days when they felt disinclined. Today, as it happened, they felt disinclined. Being reminded that it was unreasonable to keep us 3 days going up 5 miles of river, and that there was a governor at Aswan to whom we should appeal tomorrow unless the work went on in earnest, he smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and muttered something about destiny. Now the painter, being of practical turn, had compiled for himself a little vocabulary of choice Arabic maledictions, which he carried in his notebook for reference when needed. Having no faith in its possible usefulness, we were amused by the industry with which he was constantly adding to this collection. We looked upon it, in fact, as a harmless pleasantry, just as we looked upon his pocket revolver, which was never loaded, or his brand new fowling piece, which he was never known to fire. But the Sheik of the cataract had gone too far. The fatuity of that smile would have exasperated the meekest of men, and our painter was not the meekest of men. So he whipped out his pocketbook, ran his finger down the line, and delivered an appropriate quotation. His accent may not have been faultless, but there could be no mistake as to the energy of his style or the vigor of his language. The effect of both was instantaneous. The Sheik sprang to his feet as if he had been shot, turned pale with rage under his black skin, vowed the Philae might stay where she was till doomsday, for aught that he or his men would do to help her a foot farther, bounded into his own rickety sandal and rode away, leaving us to our fate. We stood aghast. It was all over with us. We should never see Abu Simbel now, never write our names on the book of the Abusir, nor slake our thirst with the waters of the second cataract. What was to be done? Must the Sheik be defied or propitiated? Should we appeal to the governor, or should we immolate the painter? The majority were for immolating the painter. We went to bed that night despairing, but lo, next morning at sunrise appeared the Sheik of the cataract, all smiles, all activity, with no end of ropes and a force of 200 men. We were his dearest friends now. The painter was his brother. He had called out the ban and arriere ban of the cataract in our service. There was nothing, in short, that he would not do to oblige us. The dragoman vowed that he had never seen Nubians work as those Nubians worked that day. They fell to like giants, tugging away from morn till dewy eve, and never giving over till they brought us round the last corner and up the last rapid. The sun had set, the afterglow had faded, the twilight was closing in, when our dahabeah slipped at last into level water, and the 200, with a parting shout, dispersed to their several villages. We were never known to make light of the painter's repertory of select abuse after this. If that notebook of his had been the drowned book of Prospero, or the magical papyrus of Thoth fished up anew from the bottom of the Nile, we could not have regarded it with a respect more nearly bordering upon awe. Though there exists no boundary line to mark where Egypt ends and Nubia begins, the nationality of the races dwelling on either side of that invisible barrier is as sharply defined as though an ocean divided them. Among the Philae, or cataract villagers, one comes suddenly into the midst of a people that have apparently nothing in common with the population of Egypt. They belong to a lower ethnological type, and they speak a language derived from purely African sources. Contrasting with our Arab sailors the sulky-looking, half-naked, muscular savages who thronged about the Philae during her passage up the cataract, one could not but perceive that they are to this day as distinct and inferior a people as when their Egyptian conquerors, massing together in one contemptuous epithet all nations south of the frontier, were wont to speak of them as the vile race of Cush. Time has done little to change them since those early days. Some Arabic words have crept into their vocabulary. Some modern luxuries, as tobacco, coffee, soap, and gunpowder, have come to be included in the brief catalogue of their daily wants. But in most other respects they are living to this day as they lived in the time of the Pharaohs, cultivating lentils and durra, brewing barley beer, plaiting mats and baskets of stained reeds, tracing rude patterns upon bowls of gourd rind, flinging the javelin, hurling the boomerang, fashioning bucklers of crocodile skin and bracelets of ivory, and supplying Egypt with henna. The dexterity of which, sitting as if in a wager boat, they balance themselves on a palm log, and paddle to and fro about the river, is really surprising. This barbaric substitute for a boat is probably more ancient than the pyramids. Having witnessed the passage of the first few rapids, we were glad to escape from the dahabeah and spend our time sketching here and there on the borders of the desert, and among the villages and islands round about. In all Egypt and Nubia there is no scenery richer in picturesque bits than the scenery of the cataract. An artist might pass a winter there, and not exhaust the pictorial wealth of those 5 miles which divide Aswan from Philae. Of tortuous creeks shut in by rocks fantastically piled, of sand slopes golden to the water's edge, of placid pools low-lying in the midst of lupin fields and tracts of tender barley, of creaking sakias, half hidden among palms and dropping water as they turn, of mud dwellings here clustered together in hollows, there perched separately on heights among the rocks, and perpetuating to this day the form and slope of Egyptian pylons, of rude boats drawn up in sheltered coves or going to pieces high and dry upon the sands, of water-washed boulders of crimson and black and purple granite, on which the wild fowl cluster at midday and the fisher spreads his nets to dry at sunset, of camels and caravans and camps on shore, of cargo boats and cangias on the river, of wild figures of half-naked athletes, of dusky women decked with barbaric ornaments, unveiled, swift-gliding, trailing long robes of deepest gentian blue, of ancient crones and little naked children like live bronzes. Of these and 100 other subjects, in infinite variety and combination, there is literally no end. It is all so picturesque, indeed so biblical, so poetical, that one is almost in danger of forgetting that the places are something more than beautiful backgrounds, and that the people are not merely appropriate figures placed there for the delight of sketchers, but are made of living flesh and blood, and moved by hopes and fears and sorrows like our own. End of section 32. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 33. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 10, The Cataract and the Desert, Part 3. Mahata, green with sycamores and tufted palms, nestled in the hollow of a little bay, half islanded in the rear by an arm of backwater, curved and glittering like the blade of a Turkish scimitar, is by far the most beautifully situated village on the Nile. It is the residence of the principal sheikh and, if one may say so, is the capital of the cataract. The houses lie some way back from the river. The bay is thronged with native boats of all sizes and colors. Men and camels, women and children, donkeys, dogs, merchandise, and temporary huts put together with poles and matting, crowd the sandy shore. It is Aswan over again, but on a larger scale. The shipping is tenfold more numerous. The traders' camp is in itself a village. The beach is half a mile in length, and a quarter of a mile in the slope down to the river. Mahata is in fact the twin port to Aswan. It lies not precisely at the other extremity of the great valley between Aswan and Philae, but at the nearest accessible point above the cataract. It is here that the Sudan traders disembark their goods for re-embarkation at Aswan. Barbaric-looking craft as these Nubian cangias we had not yet seen on the river. They looked as old and obsolete as the Ark. Some had curious carved verandas outside the cabin entrance. Others were tilted up at the stern like Chinese junks. Most of them had been slavers in the palmy days of Defterder Bay, plying then as now between Wadi Halfa and Mahata, discharging their human cargoes at this point for reshipment at Aswan, and rarely passing the cataract, even at the time of inundation. If their wicked old timbers could have spoken, they might have told us many a black and bloody tale. Going up through the village and the palm gardens, and turning off in a northeasterly direction towards the desert, one presently comes out about midway of that valley to which I have made allusion more than once already. No one, however unskilled in physical geography, could look from end to end of that huge furrow and not see that it was once a riverbed. We know not for how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years the Nile may have held on its course within those original bounds. Neither can we tell when it deserted them. It is, however, quite certain that the river flowed that way within historic times. This is to say, in the days of Amenemhat III, circa B.C. 2800. So much is held to be proven by certain inscriptions which record the maximum height of the inundation at Senna during various years of that king's reign. the Nile then rose in Ethiopia to a level some 27 feet in excess of the highest point to which it is ever known to attain at the present day. I am not aware what relation the height of this ancient bed bears to the levels recorded at Semneh, or to those now annually self-registered upon the furrowed banks of Philae, but one sees at a glance, without aid of measurements or hydrographic science, that if the river were to come down again next summer in a mighty bore, the crest of which rose 27 feet above the highest ground now fertilized by the annual overflow, it would at once refill its long deserted bed and convert Aswan into an island. Granted, then, that the Nile flowed through the desert in the time of Amenemhat III, there must at some later period have come a day when it suddenly ran dry. This catastrophe is supposed to have taken place about the time of the expulsion of the Hyksos, circa B.C. 1703, when a great disruption of the rocky barrier at Silsilis is thought to have taken place, so draining Nubia, which till now had played the part of a vast reservoir, and dispersing the pent-up floods over the plains of southern Egypt. It would, however, be a mistake to conclude that the Nile was by this catastrophe turned aside in order to be precipitated in the direction of the cataract. One arm of the river must always have taken the present lower and deeper course, while the other must of necessity have run low, perhaps very nearly dry, as the inundations subsided every spring. There remains no monumental record of this event, but the facts speak for themselves. The great channel is there. The old Nile mud is there, buried for the most part in sand, but still visible on many a rocky shelf and plateau between Aswan and Philae. There are even places where the surface of the mass is seen to be scooped out, as if by the sudden rush of the departing waves. Since that time the tides of war and commerce have flowed in their place. Every conquering Thutmose and Rameses bound for the land of Cush led his armies that way. Sabikon, at the head of his Ethiopian hordes, took that short cut to the throne of all the pharaohs. The French, under Desaix, pursuing the Memlooks after the battle of the Pyramids, swept down that pass to Philae. Meanwhile the whole trade of the Soudan, however interrupted at times by the ebb and flow of war, has also set that way. We never crossed those 5 miles of desert without encountering a train or two of baggage camels laden either with European goods for the far south, or with Oriental treasures for the north. I shall not soon forget an Abyssinian caravan which we met one day just coming out from Mahata. It consisted of 70 camels laden with elephant tusks. The tusks, which were about 14 feet in length, were packed in half dozens and sewn up in buffalo hides. Each camel was slung with 2 loads, one at either side of the hump. There must have been about 840 tusks in all. Beside each shambling beast strode a bare-footed Nubian. Following these, on the back of a gigantic camel, came a hunting leopard in a wooden cage, and a wild cat in a basket. Last of all marched a coal-black Abyssinian nearly 7 feet in height, magnificently shawled and turbaned, with a huge scimitar dangling by his side, and in his belt a pair of enormous, inlaid 17th-century pistols, such as would have become the holsters of Prince Rupert. This elaborate warrior represented the guard of the caravan. The hunting leopard and the wild cat were for Prince Hassan, the 3rd son of the Viceroy. The ivory was for exportation. Anything more picturesque than this procession, with the dust driving before it in clouds, and the children following it out of the village, would be difficult to conceive. One longed for Gérôme to paint it on the spot. The rocks on either side of the ancient riverbed are profusely hieroglyphed. These inscriptions, together with others found in the adjacent quarries, range over a period of between 3,000 and 4,000 years, beginning with the early reigns of the ancient empire and ending with the Ptolemies and Caesars. Some are mere autographs. Others run to a considerable length. Many are headed with figures of gods and worshippers. These, however, are for the most part mere graffiti, ill drawn and carelessly sculptured. The records they illustrate are chiefly votive. The passer-by adores the gods of the cataracts, implores their protection, registers his name, and states the object of his journey. The votaries are of various ranks, periods, and nationalities, but the formula in most instances is pretty much the same. Now it is a citizen of Thebes performing the pilgrimage to Philae, or a general at the head of his troops returning from a foray to Ethiopia, or a tributary prince doing homage to Rameses the Great, and associating his suzerain with the divinities of the place. Occasionally we come upon a royal cartouche and a pompous catalogue of titles, setting forth how the Pharaoh himself, the Golden Hawk, the Son of Ra, the Mighty, the Invincible, the Godlike, passed that way. It is curious to see how royalty, so many thousand years ago, set the fashion in names just as it does to this day. 9/10 of the ancient travellers who left their signatures upon these rocks were called Rameses or Tutmos or Usertasen. Others, still more ambitious, took the names of the gods. Ampesser, who hunted diligently for inscriptions both here and among the islands, found the autographs of no end of merely mortal Amons and Hathors. Our 3 days' detention in the cataract was followed by a fourth of glassy calm. There being no breath of air to fill our sails and no footing for the trackers, we could now get along only by dint of hard punting, so that it was past midday before the Philae lay moored at last in the shadow of the holy island to which she owed her name. End of section 33. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 34. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 12. Philae, Part 1. Having been for so many days within easy reach of Philae, it is not to be supposed that we were content till now with only an occasional glimpse of its towers in the distance. On the contrary, we had found our way thither towards the close of almost every day's excursion. We had approached it by land from the desert, by water in the felucca, from Mahata by way of the path between the cliffs and the river. When I add that we moored here for a night and the best part of 2 days on our way up the river, and again for a week when we came down, it will be seen that we had time to learn the lovely island by heart. The approach by water is quite the most beautiful. Seen from the level of a small boat, the island, with its palms, its colonnades, its pylons, seems to rise out of the river like a mirage. Piled rocks frame it in on either side, and purple mountains close up the distance. As the boat glides nearer between glistening boulders, those sculptured towers rise higher and ever higher against the sky. They show no sign of ruin or age. All looks solid, stately, perfect. One forgets for the moment that anything is changed. If a sound of antique chanting were to be borne along the quiet air, if a procession of white-robed priests bearing aloft the veiled ark of the god were to come sweeping round between the palms and the pylons, we should not think it strange. Most travellers land at the end nearest the cataract, so coming upon the principal temple from behind, and seeing it in reverse order. We, however, bid our Arabs row round to the southern end, where was once a stately landing place with steps down to the river. We skirt the steep banks and pass close under the beautiful little roofless temple commonly known as Pharaoh's Bed. That temple which has been so often painted, so often photographed, that every stone of it, and the platform on which it stands, and the tufted palms that cluster it, have been since childhood as familiar to our mind's eye as the Sphinx or the pyramids. It is larger, but not one jot less beautiful than we had expected, and it is exactly like the photographs. Still, one is conscious of perceiving a shade of difference too subtle for analysis, like the difference between a familiar face and the reflection of it in a looking-glass. Anyhow, one feels that the real Pharaoh's Bed will henceforth displace the photographs in that obscure mental pigeonhole where till now one has been wont to store the well-known image, and that even the photographs have undergone some kind of change. And now the corner is rounded, and the river widens away southwards between mountains and palm groves, and the prow touches the débris of a ruined quay. The bank is steep here. We climb, and a wonderful scene opens before our eyes. We are standing at the lower end of a courtyard leading up to the propylons of the great temple. The courtyard is irregular in shape, and enclosed on either side by covered colonnades. The colonnades are of unequal lengths and set at different angles. One is simply a covered walk, the other opens upon a row of small chambers, like a monastic cloister opening upon a row of cells. The roofing stones of these colonnades are in part displaced, while here and there a pillar or capital is missing, but the twin towers of the propylon, standing out in sharp unbroken lines against the sky and covered with colossal sculptures, are as perfect, or very nearly as perfect, as in the days of the Ptolemies who built them. The broad area between the colonnades is honeycombed with crude brick foundations, vestiges of a Coptic village of early Christian time. Among these we thread our way to the foot of the principal propylon, the entire width of which is 120 feet. The towers measure 60 feet from base to parapet. These dimensions are insignificant for Egypt, yet the propylon, which would look small at Luxor or Karnak, does not look small at Philae. The keynote here is not magnitude, but beauty. The island is small, that is to say, it covers an area about equal to the summit of the Acropolis at Athens, and the scale of the buildings has been determined by the size of the island. As at Athens, the ground is occupied by one principal temple of moderate size, and several subordinate chapels. Perfect grace, exquisite proportion, most varied and capricious grouping, here take the place of massiveness, so lending to Egyptian forms an irregularity of treatment that is almost Gothic, and a lightness that is almost Greek. And now we catch glimpses of an inner court, of a second propylon, of a pillared portico beyond, while, looking up to the colossal bas-reliefs above our heads, we see the usual mystic forms of kings and deities, crowned, enthroned, worshipping and worshipped. These sculptures, which at first sight looked not less perfect than the towers, proved to be as laboriously mutilated as those of Dendera. The hawk head of Horus and the cow head of Hathor have here and there escaped destruction, but the human-faced deities are literally sans eyes, sans nose, sans ears, sans everything. We enter the inner court, an irregular quadrangle enclosed on the east by an open colonnade, on the west by a chapel fronted with Hathor-headed columns, and on the north and south sides by the second and first propylons. In this quadrangle a cloistered silence reigns. The blue sky burns above, the shadows sleep below, a tender twilight lies about our feet. Inside the chapel there sleeps perpetual gloom. It was built by Ptolemy or Getes II, and is one of that order to which Champollion gave the name of Mamisi. It is a most curious place, dedicated to Hathor and commemorative of the nurture of Horus. On the blackened walls within, dimly visible by the faint light which struggles through screen and doorway, we see Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, giving birth to Horus. On the screen panels outside we trace the story of his infancy, education, and growth. As a babe at the breast, he is nursed in the lap of Hathor, the divine foster mother. As a young child he stands at his mother's knee and listens to the playing of a female harpist. We saw a barefooted boy the other day in Cairo thrumming upon a harp of just the same shape, and with precisely as many strings. As a youth he sows grains in honor of Isis, and offers a jeweled collar to Hathor. This Isis, with her long aquiline nose, thin lips, and haughty aspect, looks like one of the complimentary portraits so often introduced among the temple sculptures of Egypt. It may represent one of the two Cleopatras wedded to Ptolemy Physcon. Two greyhounds with collars round their necks are sculptured on the outer wall of another small chapel adjoining. These also look like portraits. Perhaps they were the favorite dogs of some high priest of Philae. Close against the greyhounds, and upon the same wall space, is engraven that famous copy of the inscription of the Rosetta Stone first observed here by Lepsius in A.D. 1843. It neither stands so high nor looks so illegible as Ampere, with all the jealousy of a Champollionist and a Frenchman, is at such pains to make out. One would have said that it was in a state of more than ordinarily good preservation. As a reproduction of the Rosetta Decree, however, the Philae version is incomplete. The Rosetta text, after setting forth with official pomposity the victories and munificence of the king, Ptolemy V, the ever-living, the avenger of Egypt, concludes by ordaining that the record thereof shall be engraven in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek characters, and set up in all temples of the first, second, and third class throughout the empire. Broken and battered as it is, the precious black basalt of the British Museum fulfills these conditions. The three writings are there. But at Philae, though the original hieroglyphic and Demotic text are reproduced almost verbatim, the priceless Greek transcript is wanting. It is provided for, as upon the Rosetta Stone, in the preamble. Space has been left for it at the bottom of the tablet. We even fancied we could here and there distinguish traces of red ink where the lines should come. But not one word of it has ever been cut into the surface of the stone. Taken by itself, there is nothing strange in this omission, but taken in connection with a precisely similar omission in another inscription a few yards distant, it becomes something more than a coincidence. This second inscription is cut upon the face of a block of living rock which forms part of the foundation of the easternmost tower of the second propylon. Having enumerated certain grants of land made to the temple by the 6th and 7th Ptolemies, it concludes, like the first, by decreeing that this record of the royal bounty shall be engraven in the hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, that is to say, in the ancient sacred writings of the priests, the ordinary script of the people, and the language of the court. But here again the sculptor has left his work unfinished. Here again the inscription breaks off at the end of the Demotic, leaving a blank space for the third transcript. This second omission suggests intentional neglect, and the motive for such neglect would not be far to seek. The tongue of the dominant race is likely enough to have been unpopular among the old noble and sacerdotal families, and it may well be that the priesthood of Philae, secure in their distant, solitary isle, could with impunity evade a clause which their brethren of the Delta were obliged to obey. It does not follow that the Greek rule was equally unpopular. We have reason to believe quite otherwise. The conqueror of the Persian invader was in truth the deliverer of Egypt. Alexander restored peace to the country, and the Ptolemies identified themselves with the interests of the people. A dynasty which not only lightened the burdens of the poor but respected the privileges of the rich, which honored the priesthood, endowed the temples, and compelled the Tigris to restore the spoils of the Nile, could scarcely fail to win the suffrages of all classes. The priests of Philae might despise the language of Homer while honoring the descendants of Philip of Macedon. They could naturalize the king, they could disguise his name in hieroglyphic spelling, they could depict him in the traditional dress of the pharaohs. They could crown him with the double crown, and represent him in the act of worshipping the gods of his adopted country. But they could neither naturalize nor disguise his language. Spoken or written, it was an alien thing. Carven in high places, it stood for a badge of servitude. What could a conservative hierarchy do but abhor, and when possible, ignore it? There are other sculptures in this quadrangle which one would like to linger over, as, for instance, the capitals of the eastern colonnade, no two of which are alike, and the grotesque bas-reliefs of the frieze of the Mamnesi. Of these, a quasi-heraldic group, representing the sacred hawk sitting in the centre of a fan-shaped Persia tree between two supporters, is one of the most curious, the supporters being on the one side a maniacal lion, and on the other a Typhonian hippopotamus, each grasping a pair of shears. Passing now through the doorway of the second propylon, we find ourselves facing the portico, the famous painted portico of which we had seen so many sketches that we fancied we knew it already. That second-hand knowledge goes for nothing, however, in presence of the reality, and we are as much taken by surprise as if we were the first travellers to set foot within these enchanted precincts. For here is a place in which time seems to have stood still as in that immortal palace where everything went to sleep for 100 years. The bas-reliefs on the walls, the intricate paintings on the ceilings, the colours upon the capitals, are incredibly fresh and perfect. These exquisite capitals have long been the wonder and delight of travelers in Egypt. They are all studied from natural forms, from the lotus in bud and blossom, the papyrus, and the palm. Conventionalized with consummate skill, they are at the same time so justly proportioned to the height and girth of the columns as to give an air of wonderful lightness to the whole structure. But above all, it is with the color conceived in the tender and pathetic minor of Watu and Lankrit and Gruz, that one is most fascinated. Of those delicate half-tones, the facsimile in the grammar of ornament conveys not the remotest idea. Every tint is softened, intermixed, degraded. The pinks are coralline, the greens are tempered with verdite, the blues are of a greenish turquoise like the western half of an autumnal evening sky. End of section 34. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 35. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 12, Philae, Part 2. Later on, when we returned to Philae from the second cataract, the writer devoted the best part of 3 days to making a careful study of a corner of this portico, patiently matching those subtle variations of tint, and endeavoring to master the secret of their combination. The annexed woodcut can do no more than reproduce the forms. Architecturally, this court is unlike any we have yet seen, being quite small and open to the sky in the centre, like the atrium of a Roman house. The light thus admitted glows overhead, lies in a square patch on the ground below, and is reflected upon the pictured recesses of the ceiling. At the upper end, where the pillars stand too deep, there was originally an intercolumnar screen. The rough sides of the columns show where the connecting blocks have been torn away. The pavement, too, has been pulled up by treasure-seekers, and the ground is strewn with broken slabs and fragments of shattered cornice. These are the only signs of ruin, signs traced not by the finger of time, but by the hand of the spoiler. So fresh, so fair is all the rest, that we are fain to cheat ourselves for a moment into the belief that what we see is work not marred, but arrested. Those columns, depend on it, are yet unfinished. That pavement is about to be relaid. It would not surprise us to find the masons here tomorrow morning, or the sculptor, with mallet and chisel, carrying on that band of lotus buds and bees. Far more difficult it is to believe that they all struck work forever some 22 centuries ago. Here and there, where the foundations have been disturbed, one sees that the columns are constructed of sculptured blocks, the fragments of some earlier temple, while at a height of about 6 feet from the ground, a Greek cross cut deep into the side of the shaft stamps upon each pillar the seal of Christian worship. For the Copts, who choked the colonnades and courtyards with their hovels, seized also on the temples. Some they pulled down for building material, others they appropriated. We can never know how much they destroyed, but 2 large convents on the eastern bank a little higher up the river, and a small basilica at the north end of the island, would seem to have been built with the magnificent masonry of the southern quay, as well as with blocks taken from a structure which once occupied the south-eastern corner of the great colonnade. As for this beautiful painted portico, they turned it into a chapel. A little rough-hewn niche in the east wall, and an overturned credence table fashioned from a single block of limestone, mark the site of the chancel. The Arabs, taking this last for a gravestone, have pulled it up, according to their usual practice, in search of treasure buried with the dead. On the front of the credence table, and over the niche which some unskilled but pious hand has decorated with rude Byzantine carvings, the Greek cross is again conspicuous. The religious history of Philae is so curious that it is a pity it should not find an historian. It shared with Abydos and some other places the reputation of being the burial place of Osiris. It was called the Holy Island. Its very soil was sacred. None might land upon its shores, or even approach them too nearly, without permission. To obtain that permission and perform the pilgrimage to the tomb of the god was to the pious Egyptian what the Mecca pilgrimage is to the pious Mussulman of today. The most solemn oath to which he could give utterance was, by him who sleeps in Philae. When and how the island first came to be regarded as the resting place of the most beloved of the gods does not appear, but its reputation for sanctity seems to have been of comparatively modern date. It probably rose into importance as Abydos declined. Herodotus, who is supposed to have gone as far as Elephantine, made minute inquiry concerning the river above that point, and he relates that the cataract was in the occupation of Ethiopian nomads. He, however, makes no mention of Philae or its temples. This omission on the part of one who, wherever he went, sought the society of the priests and paid particular attention to the religious observances of the country, shows that either Herodotus never got so far, or the island had not yet become the home of the Osirian mysteries. 400 years later, Diodorus Siculus describes it as the holiest of holy places, while Strabo, writing about the same time, relates that Abydos had then dwindled to a mere village. It seems possible, therefore, that at some period subsequent to the time of Herodotus and prior to that of Diodorus or Strabo, the priests of Isis may have migrated from Abydos to Philae, in which case there would have been a formal transfer not only of the relics of Osiris, but of the sanctity which had attached for ages to their original resting place. Nor is the motive for such an exodus wanting. The ashes of the god were no longer safe at Abydos. Situate in the midst of a rich country on the high road to Thebes, no city south of Memphis lay more exposed to the hazards of war. Cambyses had already passed that way. Other invaders might follow. To seek beyond the frontier that security which might no longer be found in Egypt would seem therefore to be the obvious course of a priestly guild devoted to its trust. This, of course, is mere conjecture, to be taken for what it may be worth. The decadence of Abydos coincides, at all events, with the growth of Philae, and it is only by help of some such assumption that one can understand how a new site should have suddenly arisen to such a height of holiness. The earliest temple here, of which only a small propylon remains, would seem to have been built by the last of the native pharaohs, Nectanebo II, B.C. 361, but the high and palmy days of Philae belong to the period of Greek and Roman rule. It was in the time of the Ptolemies that the Holy Island became the seat of a sacred college and the stronghold of a powerful hierarchy. Visitors from all parts of Egypt, travellers from distant lands, court functionaries from Alexandria charged with royal gifts, came annually in crowds to offer their vows at the tomb of the god. They have cut their names by hundreds all over the principal temple, just like tourists of today. Some of these antique autographs are written upon and across those of preceding visitors, while others, palimpsests upon stone, so to say, having been scratched on the yet unsculptured surface of doorway and pylon, are seen to be older than the hieroglyphic texts which were afterwards carved over them. These inscriptions cover a period of several centuries, during which time successive Ptolemies and Caesars continued to endow the island. Rich in lands, in temples, in the localization of a great national myth, the sacred college was yet strong enough in A.D. 379 to oppose a practical resistance to the edict of Theodosius. At a word from Constantinople, the whole land of Egypt was forcibly Christianized. Priests were forbidden under pain of death to perform the sacred rites. Hundreds of temples were plundered. 40,000 statues of divinities were destroyed at one fell swoop. Meanwhile the brotherhood of Philae, entrenched behind the cataract in the desert, survived the degradation of their order and the ruin of their immemorial faith. It is not known with certainty for how long they continued to transmit their hereditary privileges, but 2 of the above-mentioned votive inscriptions show that so late as A.D. 453 the priestly families were still in occupation of the island, and still celebrating the mysteries of Osiris and Isis. There even seems reason for believing that the ancient worship continued to hold its own till the end of the 6th century, at which time, according to an inscription at Kalabsheh, of which I shall have more to say hereafter, Silko, king of all the Ethiopians, himself apparently a Christian, twice invaded Lower Nubia, where God, he says, gave him the victory, and the vanquished swore to him by their idols to observe the terms of peace. There is nothing in this record to show that the invaders went beyond Taffa, the ancient Taphis, which is 27 miles above Philae, but it seems reasonable to conclude that so long as the old gods yet reigned in any part of Nubia, the island sacred to Osiris would maintain its traditional sanctity. At length, however, there must have come a day when for the last time the tomb of the god was crowned with flowers, and the lamentations of Isis were recited on the threshold of the sanctuary. And there must have come another day when the cross was carried in triumph up those painted colonnades, and the first Christian mass was chanted in the precincts of the heathen. One would like to know how these changes were brought about, whether the old faith died out for want of worshippers, or was expelled with clamour and violence. But upon this point history is vague, and the graffiti of the time are silent. We only know for certain that the old went out and the new came in, and that where the resurrected Osiris was wont to be worshipped according to the most sacred mysteries of the Egyptian ritual, the resurrected Christ was now adored after the simple fashion of the primitive Coptic Church. And now the holy island, near which it was believed no fish had power to swim or bird to fly, and upon whose soil no pilgrim might set foot without permission, became all at once the common property of a populous community. Courts, colonnades, even terraced roofs were overrun with little crude brick dwellings. A small basilica was built at the lower end of the island. The portico of the great temple was converted into a chapel and dedicated to St. Stephen. This good work, says a Greek inscription traced there by some monkish hand of the period, was done by the well-beloved of God, the Abbot Bishop Theodore. Of this same Theodore, whom another inscription styles the very Holy Father, we know nothing but his name. The walls hereabout are full of these fugitive records. The cross has conquered, and will ever conquer, writes one anonymous scribe. Others have left simple signatures, as, for instance, I, Joseph, in one place, and I, Theodosius of Nubia, in another. Here and there an added word or two give a more human interest to the autograph. So, in the pathetic scrawl of one who writes himself Johannes, a slave, we seem to read the history of a life in a single line. These Coptic signatures are all followed by the sign of the cross. The foundations of the little basilica, with its apse toward the east and its two doorways to the west, are still traceable. We set a couple of our sailors one day to clear away the rubbish at the lower end of the nave, and found the front, a rough stone basin at the foot of a broken column. It is not difficult to guess what Philae must have been like in the days of Abbot Theodore and his flock. The little basilica, we may be sure, had a cluster of mud domes upon the roof, and I fancy somehow that the abbot and his monks installed themselves in that row of cells on the east side of the great colonnade, where the priests of Isis dwelt before them. As for the village, it must have been just like Luxor, swarming with dusky life, noisy with the babble of children, the cackling of poultry, and the barking of dogs, sending up thin pillars of blue smoke at noon, echoing to the measured chime of the prayer bell at morn and even, and sleeping at night as soundly as if no ghost-like mutilated gods were looking on mournfully in the moonlight. The gods are avenged now. The creed which dethroned them is dethroned. Abbot Theodore and his successors, and the religion they taught, and the simple folk that listened to their teaching, are gone and forgotten. For the Church of Christ, which still languishes in Egypt, is extinct in Nubia. It lingered long, though doubtless in some such degraded and barbaric form as it wears in Abyssinia to this day. But it was absorbed by Islamism at last, and only a ruined convent perched here and there upon some solitary height, or a few crosses rudely carved on the walls of a Ptolemaic temple, remain to show that Christianity once passed that way. End of section 35. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 36. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 12, Philae, Part 3. The medieval history of Philae is almost a blank. The Arabs, having invaded Egypt towards the middle of the 7th century, were long in the land before they began to cultivate literature, and for more than 300 years history is silent. It is not till the 10th century that we once again catch a fleeting glimpse of Philae. The frontier is now removed to the head of the cataract. The Holy Island has ceased to be Christian, ceased to be Nubian, contains a mosque and garrison, and is the last fortified outpost of the Muslims. It still retains, and apparently continues to retain for some centuries longer, its ancient Egyptian name. That is to say, P becoming as usual converted into B, the Pilak of the hieroglyphic inscriptions becomes in Arabic Belak, which is much more like the original than the Philae of the Greeks. The native Christians, meanwhile, would seem to have relapsed into a state of semi-barbarism. They make perpetual inroads upon the Arab frontier, and suffer perpetual defeat. Battles are fought, tribute is exacted, treaties are made and broken. Towards the close of the 13th century, their king being slain and their churches plundered, they lose 1/4 of their territory, including all that part which borders upon Upper Aswan. Those who remain Christians are also condemned to pay an annual capitation tax, in addition to the usual tribute of dates, cotton, slaves, and camels. After this we may conclude that they accepted Islamism from the Arabs, as they had accepted Osiris from the Egyptians and Christ from the Romans. As Christians, at all events, we hear of them no more, for Christianity in Nubia perished root and branch, and not a Copt, it is said, may now be found above the frontier. Philae was still inhabited in A.D. 1799, when a detachment of Desaix's army under General Belliard took possession of the island, and left an inscription on the soffit of the doorway of the great pylon to commemorate the passage of the cataract. Denton, describing the scene with his usual vivacity, relates how the natives first defied and then fled from the French, flinging themselves into the river, drowning such of their children as were too young to swim, and escaping into the desert. They appear at this time to have been mere savages, the women ugly and sullen, the men naked, agile, quarrelsome, and armed not only with swords and spears, but with matchlock guns, which they used to keep up a brisk and well-directed fire. Their abandonment of the island probably dates from this time, for when Burckhardt went up in A.D. 1813, he found it, as we found it to this day, deserted and solitary. One poor old man, if indeed he still lives, is now the one inhabitant of Philae, and I suspect he only crosses over from Biga in the tourist season. He calls himself, with or without authority, the guardian of the island, sleeps in a nest of rags and straw in a sheltered corner behind the great temple, and is so wonderfully wizened and bent and knotted up that nothing of him seems quite alive except his eyes. We gave him 50 copper paras for a parting present when on our way back to Egypt, and he was so oppressed by the consciousness of wealth that he immediately buried his treasure and implored us to tell no one what we had given him. With the French siege and the flight of the native population closes the last chapter of the local history of Philae. The Holy Island has done henceforth with wars of creeds or kings. It disappears from the domain of history and enters the domain of science. To have contributed to the discovery of the hieroglyphic alphabet is a high distinction, and in no sketch of Philae, however slight, should the obelisk that furnished Champollion with the name of Cleopatra be allowed to pass unnoticed. This monument, second only to the Rosetta Stone in point of philological interest, was carried off by Mr. W. Banks, the discoverer of the first tablet of Abydos, and is now in Dorsetshire. Its empty socket and its fellow obelisk, mutilated and solitary, remain in situ at the southern extremity of the island. And now, for we have lingered over long in the portico, it is time we glanced at the interior of the temple. So we go in at the central door, beyond which open some 9 or 10 halls and side chambers leading, as usual, to the sanctuary. Here all is dark, earthy, oppressive. In rooms unlighted by the faintest gleam from without, we find smoke-blackened walls covered with elaborate bas-reliefs. Mysterious passages, pitch dark, thread the thickness of the walls and communicate by means of trap-like openings with vaults below. In the sanctuary lies an overthrown altar, while in the corner behind it stands the very niche in which Strabo must have seen that poor sacred hawk of Ethiopia which he describes as sick and nearly dead. But in this temple, dedicated not only to Isis, but to the memory of Osiris and the worship of Horus their son, there is one chamber which we may be quite sure was shown neither to Strabo nor Diodorus, nor to any stranger of alien faith, be his repute or station what it might, a chamber holy above all others, holier even than the sanctuary, the chamber sacred to Osiris. We, however, unrestricted, unforbidden, are free to go where we list, and our books tell us that this mysterious chamber is somewhere overhead. So, emerging once again into the daylight, we go up a well-worn staircase leading out upon the roof. This roof is an intricate, up-and-down place, and the room is not easy to find. It lies at the bottom of a little flight of stairs, a small stone cell some 12 feet square, lighted only from the doorway. The walls are covered with sculptures representing the shrines, the mummification, and the resurrection of Osiris. These shrines, containing each some part of his body, are variously fashioned. His head, for instance, rests on a nilometer. His arm, surmounted by a head, is sculptured on a stela, in shape resembling a high-shouldered boulder, surmounted by one of the head-dresses peculiar to the god. His legs and feet lie full length in a pylon-shaped mausoleum. Upon another shrine stands the meter-shaped crown which he wears as judge of the lower world. Isis and Nephthys keep guard over each shrine. In a lower frieze we see the mummy of the god laid upon a bier, with the 4 so-called canopic jars ranged underneath. A little farther on he lies in state, surrounded by lotus buds on tall stems, figurative of growth or returning life. Finally he is depicted lying on a couch, his limbs reunited, his head, left hand, and left foot upraised, as in the act of returning to consciousness. Nephthys, in the guise of a winged genius, fans him with the breath of life. Isis, with outstretched arms, stands at his feet and seems to be calling him back to her embraces. The scene represents in fact that supreme moment when Isis pours forth her passionate invocations, and Osiris is resuscitated by virtue of the songs of the divine sisters. Ill-modelled and ill-cut as they are, there is a clownish naturalness about these little sculptures which lifts them above the conventional dead level of ordinary Ptolemaic work. The figures tell their tale intelligibly. Osiris seems really struggling to rise, and the action of Isis expresses clearly enough the intention of the artist. Although a few heads have been mutilated and the surface of the stone is somewhat degraded, the subjects are by no means in a bad state of preservation. In the accompanying sketches, nothing has been done to improve the defective drawing or repair the broken outlines of the originals. Osiris in one has lost his foot, and in another his face. The hands of Isis are as shapeless as those of a bran doll, and the naivete of the treatment verges throughout upon caricature. But the interest attaching to them is altogether apart from the way in which they are executed. And now, returning to the roof, it is pleasant to breathe the fresher air that comes with sunset, to see the island in shape like an ancient Egyptian shield, lying mapped out beneath one's feet. From here we look back upon the way we have come, and forward to the way we are going. Northward lies the cataract, a network of islets with flashes of river between. Southward the broad current comes on in one smooth glossy sheet, unbroken by a single rapid. How eagerly we turn our eyes that way, for yonder lie Abu Simbel and all the mysterious lands beyond the cataracts. But we cannot see far, for the river curves away grandly to the right, and vanishes behind a range of granite hills. A similar chain hems in the opposite bank, while high above the palm groves fringing the edge of the shore stand 2 ruined convents on 2 rocky prominences, like a couple of castles on the Rhine. On the east bank opposite, a few mud houses and a group of superb carob trees mark the site of a village, the greater part of which lies hidden among palms. Behind this village opens a vast sand alley, like an arm of the sea from which the waters have retreated. The old channel along which we rode the other day went ploughing that way straight across from Philae. Last of all, forming the western side of this fourfold view, we have the island of Biga, rugged, mountainous, and divided by Philae by so narrow a channel that every sound from the native village on the opposite steep is as audible as though it came from the courtyard at our feet. That village is built in and about the ruins of a tiny Ptolemaic temple, of which only a screen and doorway and part of a small propylon remain. We can see a woman pounding coffee on the threshold of one of the huts, and some children scrambling about the rocks in pursuit of a wandering turkey. Catching sight of us up here on the roof of the temple, they come whooping and scampering down to the waterside, and with shrill cries importune us for baksheesh. Unless the stream is wider than it looks, one might almost pitch a piastra into their outstretched hands. Mr. Hay, it is said, discovered a secret passage of solid masonry tunnelled under the river from island to island. The entrance on this side was from a shaft in the temple of Isis. We are not told how far Mr. Hay was able to penetrate in the direction of Biga, but the passage would lead up most probably to the little temple opposite. Perhaps the most entirely curious and unaccustomed features in all this scene are the mountains. They are like none that any of us have seen in our diverse wanderings. Other mountains are homogeneous, and thrust themselves up from below in masses suggestive of primitive disruption and upheaval. These seem to lie upon the surface foundationless, rock loosely piled on rock, boulder on boulder, like stupendous cairns, the work of demigods and giants. Here and there, on shelf or summit, a huge rounded mass, many tons in weight, hangs poised capriciously. Most of these blocks, I am persuaded, would log if put to the test. But for a specimen stone, commend me to yonder amazing monolith down by the water's edge opposite, near the carob trees and the ferry. Though but a single block of orange-red granite, it looks like three, and the Arabs, seeing it in some fancied resemblance to an arm-chair, call it Pharaoh's throne. Rounded and polished by primeval floods, and emblazoned with royal cartouches of extraordinary size, it seems to have attracted the attention of pilgrims of all ages. Kings, conquerors, priests, travellers have covered it with records of victories, of religious festivals, of prayers and offerings, and acts of adoration. Some of these are older, by 1,000 years and more, than the temples on the island opposite. Such, roundly summed up, are the fourfold surroundings of Philae: the cataract, the river, the desert, the environing mountains. The holy island, beautiful, lifeless, a thing of the far past, with all its wealth of sculpture, painting, history, poetry, tradition, sleeps, or seems to sleep, in the midst. It is one of the world's famous landscapes, and it deserves its fame. Every sketcher sketches it, every traveller describes it. Yet it is just one of those places of which the objective and subjective features are so equally balanced that it bears putting neither into words nor colours. The sketcher must perforce leave out the atmosphere of association which informs his subject, and the writer's description is at best no better than a catalogue raisonné. End of section 36. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 37. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 13. Philae to Korosko, Part 1. Sailing gently southward, the river opening wide before us, Philae dwindling in the rear, we feel that we are now fairly over the border, and that if Egypt was strange and far from home, Nubia is stranger and farther still. The Nile here flows deep and broad. The rocky heights that hem it in so close on either side are still black on the one hand, golden on the other. The banks are narrower than ever. The space in some places is little wider than a towing path. In others there is barely room for a belt of date palms and a slip of alluvial soil, every foot of which produces its precious growth of durra or barley. The steep verge below is green with lentils to the water's edge. As the river recedes, it leaves each day a margin of fresh, wet soil, in which the careful husbandman hastens to scratch a new furrow and sow another line of seeds. He cannot afford to let so much as an inch of that kindly mud lie idle. Gliding along with half-filled sail, we observe how entirely the population seems to be regulated by the extent of arable soil. Where the inundation has room to spread, villages come thicker, more dusky figures are seen moving to and fro in the shade of the palms, more children race along the banks, shrieking for bakshish. When the shelf of soil is narrowed, on the contrary, to a mere fringe of luminous green dividing the rock from the river, there is a startling absence of everything like life. Mile after mile drags its slow length along, uncheered by any sign of human habitation. When now and then a solitary native, armed with gun or spear, is seen striding along the edge of the desert, he only seems to make the general solitude more apparent. Meanwhile, it is not only men and women whom we miss, men laboring by the riverside, women with babies astride on their shoulders or water jars balanced on their heads, but birds, beasts, boats, everything that we have been used to see along the river. The buffaloes dozing at midday in the shallows, the camels stalking home in single file towards sunset, the waterfowl haunting the sandbanks, seem suddenly to have vanished. Even donkeys are now rare, and as for horses, I do not remember to have seen one during the 7 weeks we spent in Nubia. All night, too, instead of the usual chorus of dogs barking furiously from village to village, we hear only the long-drawn wail of an occasional jackal. It is not wonderful, however, that animal life should be scarce in a district where the scant soil yields barely food enough for those who till it. To realize how very scant it is, one only needs to remember that about Dare, where it is at its widest, the annual deposit nowhere exceeds half a mile in breadth, while for the most part of the way between Philae and Wadi Halfa, a distance of 210 miles, it averages from 6 to 60 yards. Here, then, more than ever, one seems to see how entirely these lands which we call Egypt and Nubia are nothing but the banks of one solitary river in the midst of a world of desert. In Egypt the valley is often so wide that one forgets the stony waste beyond the cornlands. But in Nubia the desert is ever present. We cannot forget it if we would. The barren mountains press upon our path, showering down avalanches of granite on the one side and torrents of yellow sand on the other. We know that those stones are always falling, that those sands are always drifting, that the river has hard work to hold its own, and that the desert is silently encroaching day by day. These golden sand streams are the newest and most beautiful feature in the landscape. They pour down from the high level of the Libyan desert, just as the snows of Switzerland pour down from the upper plateaus of the Alps. Through every ravine and gap they find a channel, here trickling in tiny rivulets, flowing yonder in broad torrents that widen to the river. Becalmed a few miles above Philae, we found ourselves at the foot of one of these large drifts. The MBs challenged us to climb the slope and see the sunset from the desert. It was about 6 o'clock, and the thermometer was standing at 80 degrees in the coolest corner of the large saloon. We ventured to suggest that the top was a long way up, but the MBs would take no refusal. So away we went, panting, breathless, bewailing our hard fate. L and the rider had done some difficult walking in their time, over ice and snow, on lava cold and hot, up cinder slopes and beds of mountain torrents, but this innocent-looking sand-drift proved quite as hard to climb as any of them. The sand lies wonderfully loose and light, and is as hot as if it had been baked in an oven. Into this the foot plunges ankle-deep, slipping back at every step and leaving a huge hole into which the sand pours down again like water. Looking back, you trace your course by a succession of funnel-shaped pits, each larger than a wash-hand basin. Though your slipper be as small as Cinderella's, the next comer shall not be able to tell whether it was a lady who went up last or a camel. It is toilsome work, too, for the foot finds neither rest nor resistance, and the strain upon the muscles is unremitting. But the beauty of the sand more than repays the fatigue of climbing it. Smooth, sheeny, satiny, fine as diamond dust, supple, undulating, luminous, it lies in the most exquisite curves and wreaths like a snowdrift turned gold. Remodelled by every breath that blows, its ever-varying surface presents an endless play of delicate lights and shadows. There lives not the sculptor who could render those curves, and I doubt whether Turner himself, in his tenderest and subtlest mood, could have done justice to those complex greys and ambers. Having paused to rest upon an outcropping ledge of rock about half-way up, we came at length to the top of the last slope and found ourselves on the level of the desert. Here, faithful to the course of the river, the first objects to meet our eyes were the old familiar telegraph posts and wires. Beyond them, to north and south, a crowd of peaks closed in the view, but westward a rolling waste of hillock and hollow opened away to where the sun, a crimson globe, had already half vanished below the rim of the world. One could not resist going a few steps farther, just to touch the nearest of those telegraph posts. It was like reaching out a hand towards home. End of section 37. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 38. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 13. Philae to Korosko, Part 2. When the sun dropped, we turned back. The valley below was already steeped in dusk. The Nile, glimmering like a coiled snake in the shade, reflected the evening sky in 3 separate reaches. On the Arabian side, a far-off mountain chain stood out, purple and jagged against the eastern horizon. To come down again was easy. Driving our heels well into the sand, we half ran, half glissaded, and soon reached the bottom. Here we were met by an old Nubian woman, who had trudged up in all haste from the nearest village to question our sailors about one Yusuf, her son, of whom she had heard nothing for nearly a year. She was a very poor old woman, a widow, and this Yusuf was her only son. Hoping to better himself, he had worked his passage to Cairo in a cargo boat some 18 months ago. Twice since then he had sent her messages and money, but now 11 months had gone by in silence, and she feared he must be dead. Meanwhile her date palm, taxed to the full value of its produce, had this year yielded not a piastra of profit. Her mud hut had fallen in, and there was no Yusuf to repair it. Old and sick, she could now only beg, and her neighbours, by whose charity she subsisted, were but a shade less poor than herself. Our men knew nothing of the missing Yusuf. Rais Hassan promised when he went back to make inquiries among the boatmen of Bulak. But then, he added, there are so many Yusufs in Cairo. It made one's heart ache to see the tremulous eagerness with which the poor soul put her questions, and the crushed look in her face when she turned away. And now, being fortunate in respect of the wind, which for the most part blows steadily from the north between sunrise and sunset, we make good progress, and for the next 10 days live pretty much on board our dahabeah. The main features of the landscape go on repeating themselves with but little variation from day to day. The mountains wear their habitual livery of black and gold. The river, now widening, now narrowing, flows between banks blossoming with lentils and lupins. With these, and yellow acacia tufts and blue castor oil berries, and the weird coloquintida with its downy leaf and milky juice and puff bladder fruit, like a green peach tinged with purple, we make our daily bouquet for the dinner table. All other flowers have vanished, and even these are hard to get in a land where every green blade is precious to the grower. Now, too, the climate becomes sensibly warmer. The heat of the sun is so great at midday that, even with the north breeze blowing, we can no longer sit on deck between 12 and 3. Towards sundown, when the wind drops, it turns so sultry that to take a walk on shore comes to be regarded as a duty rather than a pleasure. Thanks, however, to that indomitable painter who is always ready for an afternoon excursion, we do sometimes walk for an hour before dinner, striking off generally into the desert, looking for onyxes and carnelians among the pebbles that here and there strew the surface of the sand, and watching in vain for jackals and desert hares. Sometimes we follow the banks instead of the desert, coming now and then to a creaking sakia turned by a melancholy buffalo, or to a native village hidden behind dwarf palms. Here each hut has its tiny forecourt, in the midst of which stand the mud oven and mud cupboard of the family, two dumpy cones of smooth grey clay like big chimney pots, the one capped with a lid, the other fitted with a little wooden door and a wooden bolt. Some of the houses have barbaric ornament palmed off, so to say, upon the walls, the pattern being simply the impression of a human hand dipped in red or yellow ochre, and applied while the surface is moist. The amount of bazaar that takes place whenever we enter one of these villages is quite alarming. The dogs give first notice of our approach, and presently we are surrounded by all the women and girls of the place, offering live pigeons, eggs, vegetable marrows, necklaces, nose rings, and silver bracelets for sale. The boys pester us to buy wretched, half-dead chameleons. The men stand aloof, and leave the bargaining to the women. And the women not only know how to bargain, but how to assess the relative value of every coin that passes current on the Nile. Rupees, rubles, rials, dollars, and shillings are as intelligible to them as paras or piastres. Sovereigns are not too heavy nor Napoleons too light for them. The times are changed since Belzoni's Nubian, after staring contemptuously at the first piece of money he had ever seen, asked who would give anything for that small piece of metal. The necklaces consisted of onyx, carnelian, bone, silver, and coloured glass beads, with now and then a stray scarab or amulet in the ancient blue porcelain. The arrangement of colour is often very subtle. The brow pendants in gold repoussé, and the massive old silver bracelets, rough with knobs and bosses, are most interesting in design, and perpetuate patterns of undoubted antiquity. The M.B.'s picked up one really beautiful collarette of silver and coral, which might have been worn 3,000 years ago by Pharaoh's daughter. While on board we began now to keep a sharp look-out for crocodiles. We hear of them constantly, see their tracks upon the sandbanks in the river, go through agonies of exploration over every black speck in the distance, yet are perpetually disappointed. The farther south we go, the more impatient we become. The E's, whose dahabeah, homeward bound, drifts slowly past one calm morning, report 11 beauties, seen all together yesterday upon a sand island some 10 miles higher up. Mr. C.B.'s boat, garlanded with crocodiles from stem to stern, fills us with envy. We would give our ears, almost, to see one of these engaging reptiles dangling from either our own mainmast or that of the faithful Bagstones. Alfred, who has his heart set on bagging at least half a dozen, says nothing, but grows gloomier day by day. At night, when the moon is up and less misanthropic folk are in bed and asleep, he rambles moodily into the desert after jackals. End of section 38. "1,000 Miles Up the Nile", section 39. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 13. Philae to Korosko, Part 3. Meanwhile on we go, starting at sunrise, mooring at sunset, sailing, tracking, punting, never stopping for an hour by day if we can help it, and pushing straight for Abu Simbel with as little delay as possible. Thus we pass the pylons of Debod with their background of desert, Gertas, a miniature Sunium seen towards evening against the glowing sunset, Tafa rich in palms with white columns gleaming through green foliage by the waterside, the cliffs, islands, and rapids of Kalabsha, and the huge temple which rises like a fortress in their midst, Dender, a tiny chapel with a single pylon, and Gerf Hassein, which from this distance might be taken for the mouth of a rock-cut tomb in the face of the precipice. About half-way between Kalabsha and Dender we enter the Tropic of Cancer. From this day till the day when we repass that invisible boundary, there is a marked change in the atmospheric conditions under which we live. The days get gradually hotter, especially at noon, when the sun is almost vertical, but the freshness of night and the chill of early morning are no more. Unless a strong wind blows from the north, we no longer know what it is to need a shawl on deck in the evening, or an extra covering on our beds towards dawn. We sleep with our cabin windows open, and enjoy a delicious equality of temperature from sundown to sunrise. The days and nights, too, are of almost equal length. Now also the Southern Cross and a second group of stars, which we conclude must form part of the Centaur, are visible between 2 and 4 every morning. They have been creeping up, a star at a time, for the last fortnight, but are still so low upon the eastern horizon that we can only see them when there comes a break in the mountain chain on that side of the river. At the same time, our old familiar friends of the northern hemisphere, looking strangely distorted and out of their proper place, are fast disappearing on the opposite side of the heavens. Orion seems to be lying on his back, and the Great Bear to be standing on his tail, while Cassiopeia and a number of others have deserted en masse. The zenith, meanwhile, is but thinly furnished, so that we seem to have travelled away from the one hemisphere, and not yet to have reached the other. As for the Southern Cross, we reserve our opinion till we get farther south. It would be treason to hint that we are disappointed in so famous a constellation. After Gerf Hossein, the next place of importance for which our maps bid us look out is Dacca. As we draw near, expecting hourly to see something of the temple, the Nile increases in breadth and beauty. It is a peaceful, glassy morning. The men have been tracking since dawn, and stopped to breakfast at the foot of a sandy bank, wooded with tamarisks and gum trees. A glistening network of gossamer floats from bough to bough. The sky overhead is of a tender luminous blue, such as we never see in Europe. The air is wonderfully still. The river, which here takes a sudden bend towards the east, looks like a lake, and seems to be barred ahead by the desert. Presently a funeral passes along the opposite bank, the chief mourner flourishing a long staff like a drum major, the women snatching up handfuls of dust and scattering it upon their heads. We hear their wild wail long after the procession is out of sight. Going on again presently, our whole attention becomes absorbed by the new and singular geological features of the Libyan desert. A vast plain covered with isolated mountains of volcanic structure, it looks like some strange transformation of the Puy de Dôme plateau, with all its wind-swept pastures turned to sand, and its grassy craters stripped to barrenness. The more this plain widens out before our eyes, the more it bristles with peaks. As we round the corner, and Dacca, like a smaller Edfu, comes into sight upon the western bank, the whole desert on that side, as far as the eye can see, presents the unmistakable aspect of one vast field of volcanoes. As in Auvergne, these cones are of all sizes and heights, some low and rounded, like mere bubbles that have cooled without bursting, others ranging apparently from 1,000 to 1,500 feet in height. The broken craters of several are plainly distinguishable by the help of a field glass. One in particular is so like our old friend the Puy de Perrot that in a mere black and white sketch the one might readily be mistaken for the other. We were surprised to find no account of the geology of this district in any of our books. Murray and Wilkinson pass it in silence, and writers of travels, one or two of whom notice only the pyramidal shape of the hills, are for the most part content to do likewise. None seem to have observed their obvious volcanic origin. Thanks to a light breeze springing up in the afternoon, we were able to hoist our big sail again and to relieve the men from tracking. Thus we glided past the ruins of Maharaca, which, seen from the river, looked like a Greek portico set in a hollow waste of burning desert. Next came Wadi Sabua, a temple half buried in sand, near which we met a tiny dahabeah manned by 2 Nubians and flying the star and crescent. A shabby government inspector in European dress and a fez lay smoking on a mat outside his cabin door, while from a spar overhead there hung a mighty crocodile. This monster was of a greenish-brown color, and measured at least 16 feet from head to tail. His jaws yawned, and one flat and flabby arm and ponderous paw swung with the motion of the boat, looking horribly human. The painter, with an eye to foregrounds, made a bid for him on the spot, but the shabby inspector was not to be moved by considerations of game. he preferred his crocodile to infidel gold, and scarcely deigned even to reply to the offer. Seen in the half-light of a tropical afterglow, the purple mountains coming down in detached masses to the water's edge on the one side, the desert with its volcanic peaks yet rosy upon the other, we thought the approach to Korosko more picturesque than anything we had yet seen south of the cataract. As the dusk deepened, the moon rose, and the palms that had just room to grow between the mountains and the river turned from bronze to silver. It was half twilight, half moonlight by the time we reached the mooring place, where Ptolemy, who had been sent forward in the small boat half an hour ago, jumped on board laden with a packet of letters and a sheaf of newspapers. For here, where the great caravan route leads off across the desert to Khartoum, we touched the first Nubian post office. It was only 10 days since we had received our last budget at Aswan, but it seemed like 10 weeks. End of section 39.
Miles Up the Nile, section 40. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 14. Korosko to Abu Simbel, Part 1. It so happened that we arrived at Korosko on the eve of El-Eid el-Kebir, or the anniversary of the sacrifice of Abraham, when, according to the Muslim version, Ishmael was the intended victim, and a ram the substituted offering. Now El-Eid el-Kebir, being one of the great feasts of the Mohammedan calendar, is a day of gifts and good wishes. The rich visit their friends and distribute meat to the poor, and every true believer goes to the mosque to say his prayers in the morning. So instead of starting as usual at sunrise, we treated our sailors to a sheep, and waited till past noon that they might make holiday. They began the day by trooping off to the village mosque in all the glory of new blue blouses, spotless turbans, and scarlet leather slippers, then loitered about till dinner time, when the said sheep, stewed with lentils and garlic, brought the festivities to an end. It was a thin and ancient beast, and must have been horribly tough, but an epicure might have envied the childlike enjoyment with which our honest fellows squatted, cross-legged and happy, round the smoking cauldron, chattering, laughing, feasting, dipping their fingers in the common mess, washing the whole down with long draughts of Nile water, and finishing off with a hubble-bubble passed from lip to lip, and a mouthful of muddy coffee. By a little after midday they had put off their finery, harnessed themselves to the tow-rope, and set to work to haul us through the rocky shoals which here impede the current. From Korosko to Dare the actual distance is about 11 miles and a half, but what with obstructions in the bed of the river, and what with a wind that would have been favourable but for another great bend which the Nile takes towards the east, those 11 miles and a half cost us the best part of 2 days' hard tracking. Landing from time to time when the boat was close in-shore, we found the order of planting everywhere the same: lupins and lentils on the slope against the water-line, an uninterrupted grove of palms on the edge of the bank, in the space beyond, fields of cotton and young corn, and then the desert. The arable soil was divided off, as usual, by hundreds of water channels, and seemed to be excellently farmed as well as abundantly irrigated. Not a weed was to be seen, not an inch of soil appeared to be wasted. In odd corners where there was room for nothing else, cucumbers and vegetable marrows flourished and bore fruit. Nowhere had we seen castor berries so large, cotton pods so full, or palms so lofty. Here also, for the first time in Egypt, we observed among the bushes a few hoopoes and other small birds, and on a sand slope down by the river a group of wild ducks. We, that is to say, one of the M.B.'s and the writer, had wandered off that way in search of crocodiles. The 2 dahabeahs, each with its file of trackers, were slowly labouring up against the current about a mile away. All was intensely hot and intensely silent. We had walked far, and had seen no crocodile. What we should have done if we had met with one I am not prepared to say. Perhaps we should have run away. At all events, we were just about to turn back when we caught sight of the ducks sunning themselves, half asleep, on the brink of a tiny pool about 1/8 of a mile away. Creeping cautiously under the bank, we contrived to get within a few yards of them. There were 4, a drake, a duck, and 2 young ones, exquisitely feathered and as small as teal. The parent birds could scarcely have measured more than 8 inches from head to tail. All alike had chestnut-colored heads with a narrow buff stripe down the middle, like a parting, maroon backs, wing feathers maroon and gray, and tails tipped with buff. They were so pretty, and the little family party was so complete, that the writer could not help secretly rejoicing that Alfred and his gun were safe on board the Bagstones. High above the Libyan bank on the sloping verge of the desert, stands, half drowned in sand, the little temple of Amata. Seeing it from the opposite side while duck-hunting in the morning, I had taken it for one of the many stone shelters erected by Mohammed Ali for the accommodation of cattle levied annually in the Soudan. It proved, however, to be a temple, small but massive, built with squared blocks of sandstone, and dating back to the very old times of the Usertesens and Tutmoses. It consists of a portico, a transverse atrium, and 3 small chambers. The pillars of the portico are mere square piers. The rooms are small and low. The roof, constructed of oblong blocks, is flat from end to end. As an architectural structure, it is in fact but a few degrees removed from Stonehenge. A shed without, this little temple is, however, a cameo within. Nowhere save in the tomb of Tea had we seen bas-reliefs so delicately modelled, so rich in colour. Here, as elsewhere, the walls are covered with groups of kings and gods and hieroglyphic texts. The figures are slender and animated. The head-dresses, jewellery, and patterned robes are elaborately drawn and painted. Every head looks like a portrait, every hieroglyphic form is a study in miniature. Apart from its exquisite finish, the wall sculpture of Amata has, however, nothing in common with the wall sculpture of the ancient empire. It belongs to the period of Egyptian Renaissance, and, though inferior in power and naturalness to the work of the elder school, it marks just that moment of special development when the art of modelling in low relief had touched the highest level to which it ever again attained. The highest level belongs to the reigns of Thutmose II and Thutmose III, just as the perfect era in architecture belongs to the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II. It is for this reason that Amata is so precious. It registers an epoch in the history of the art, and gives us the best of that epoch in the hour of its zenith. The sculptor is here seen to be working within bounds already prescribed, yet within those bounds he still enjoys a certain liberty. His art, though largely conventionalized, is not yet stereotyped. His sense of beauty still finds expression. There is, in short, a grace and sweetness about the bas-relief designs of Amata for which one looks in vain to the storied walls of Karnak. The chambers are half choked with sand, and we had to crawl into the sanctuary upon our hands and knees. A long inscription at the upper end records how Amenhotep II, returning from his first campaign against the Rutin, slew 7 kings with his own hand, 6 of whom were gibbeted upon the ramparts of Thebes, while the body of the 7th was sent to Ethiopia by water and suspended on the outer wall of the city of Napata, in order that the negroes might behold the victories of the Pharaoh in all the lands of the world. In the darkest corner of the atrium we observed a curious tableau representing the king embraced by a goddess. He holds a short straight sword in his right hand, and the crux ansata in his left. On his head he wears the kephersh, or war helmet, a kind of blue mitre studded with gold stars and ornamented with the royal asp. The goddess clasps him lovingly about the neck, and bends her lips to his. The artist has given her the yellow complexion conventionally ascribed to women, but her saucy mouth and nez retroussé are distinctly European. Dressed in the fashion of the 19th century, she might have served Leech as a model for his girl of the period. The sand has drifted so high at the back of the temple that one steps upon the roof as upon a terrace only just raised above the level of the desert. Soon that level will be equal, and if nothing is done to rescue it within the next generation or two, the whole building will become engulfed, and its very site forgotten. The view from the roof, looking back towards Korosko and forward towards Dare, is one of the finest, perhaps quite the finest, in Nubia. The Nile curves grandly through the foreground. The palm woods of Dare are green in the distance. The mountain region which we have just traversed ranges, a vast crescent of multitudinous peaks, round 2/3 of the horizon. Ridge beyond ridge, chain beyond chain, flushing crimson in light and deepening through every tint of amethyst and purple in shadow, these innumerable summits fade into tenderest blue upon the horizon. As the sun sets they seem to glow, to become incandescent, to be touched with flame, as in the old time when every crater was a font of fire. Struggling next morning through a maze of sandbanks, we reached Dare soon after breakfast. This town, the Nubian capital, lies a little lower than the level of the bank, so that only a few mud walls are visible from the river. Having learned by this time that a capital is but a bigger village, containing perhaps a mosque and a market space, we were not disappointed by the unimposing aspect of the Nubian metropolis. Great, however, was our surprise when, instead of the usual clamorous crowd, screaming, pushing, scrambling, and bothering for baksheesh, we found the landing place deserted. 2 or 3 native boats lay up under the bank, empty. There was literally not a soul in sight. L and the little lady, eager to buy some of the basketwork for which the place is famous, looked blank. Ptolemy, anxious to lay in a store of fresh eggs and vegetables, looked blanker. We landed. Before us lay an open space, at the farther end of which, facing the river, stood the governor's palace, the said palace being a magnified mud hut, with a frieze of baked bricks round the top, and an imposing stone doorway. In this doorway, according to immemorial usage, the great man gives audience. We saw him, a mere youth apparently, puffing away at a long chibouk, in the midst of a little group of grey-beard elders. They looked at us gravely, immovably, like smoking automata. One longed to go up and ask them if they were all transformed to black granite from the waist to the feet, and if the inhabitants of Dare had been changed into bluestones. Still bent on buying baskets, if baskets were to be bought, bent also on finding out the whereabouts of a certain rock-cut temple which our books told us to look for at the back of the town, we turned aside into a straggling street leading towards the desert. The houses looked better built than usual, some pains having evidently been bestowed in smoothing the surface of the mud, and ornamenting the doorways with fragments of coloured pottery. A cracked willow-pattern dinner-plate, set like a fanlight over one, and a white soup-plate over another, came doubtless from the canteen of some English dahabeah, and were the pride of their possessors. Looking from end to end of this street, and it was a tolerably long one, with the Nile at one end and the desert at the other, we saw no sign or shadow of moving creature. Only one young woman, hearing strange voices talking in a strange tongue, peeped out suddenly from a half-open door as we went by, then, seeing me look at the baby in her arms, which was hideous and had sore eyes, drew her veil across its face, and darted back again. She thought I coveted her treasure, and she dreaded the evil eye. All at once we heard a sound like the far-off quivering of many owls. It shrilled, swelled, wavered, dropped, then died away, like the moaning of the wind at sea. We held our breath, and listened. We had never heard anything so wild and plaintive. Then suddenly, through an opening between the houses, we saw a great crowd on a space of rising ground about 1/4 of a mile away. This crowd consisted of men only, a close, turbaned mass some 300 or 400 in number, all standing quite still and silent, all looking in the same direction. Hurrying on to the desert, we saw the strange sight at which they were looking. End of Section 40.